How many times have you sold or salvaged your best in slot gear? You probably don't even know. I know I don't. First, we're going to look at identifying which affixes we want on each gear slot. Now, I created a little cheat sheet here, but it doesn't mean that these affixes are always going to be your best in slot for every build. But if you go with these as kind of a base, you'll be in a pretty good spot. All right, so let's start from the top with helms. First up, ranks to a useful skill. From there, we look at total armor, max life, CC duration are all good defensive options. And then also cooldown reduction is pretty good if you run a cooldown build. And then non-main stat. We're going to talk about non-main stats and stats a little bit later on after I do a rundown of the gear. And then moving down to the chest, then we have a bonus to raw damage. This is a great one that just applies to everything. Additionally, elemental type damage, and then a skill type damage. Now you want to try and find those two affixes that are for your build and are the same thing, basically. Last options, look for something more defensive. Max life is always good, total armor. And then you want to pick a defensive or utility kind of affix that works with your build, works with the other gear that you have as well. So for gloves, we're looking at rank in a single core skill. You can get 2 to 4 ranks in that. Now, a lot of these items can get multiple core skills on them. Just roll off the other one. You only really need one. And then we're looking for crit strike chance, non-main stat to fill in. And then you kind of have some options. Lucky hit chance, if you're running lucky hit. Attack speed, something like that. It's always pretty good. For pants, I recommend going with the while injured, potion grants a bonus max life as barrier. There are other options for potions, but this one's gonna be the best because it's while you're injured and you're basically trying not to die. The other perks aren't quite as good as what this gives you. For the affixes, we're looking for rank 1 to a skill set. Potion capacity. Increase of potion capacity is a huge benefit. It lets you just spam potions so much. From there, we're looking for damage to elites. A lot of times our builds are great at, AoE damage and pulling big packs. And then we get down to the elites and it's really kind of frustrating to knock out the 2 or 3 elites that are there. Get that bonus damage to elites on your pants. From there, again, basic defense, max life, total armor, damage reduction. Last up for gear, we're looking at boots. I prefer max evade charge because it works for my build. However, if you have a build that runs, let's say barbarian, where you're running frenzy and you just have really fast attack speed, you can go with attacks reduce evade cooldown by 0.5 seconds. And on boots, we're looking for ranks to a skill set, damage to elites again, movement speed on boots I think is really helpful. And also we have dodge chance on boots. Dodge chance is pretty good, but we don't want to rely on it too much. It's one of those that is it mitigates a lot of damage. However, when you do get hit, if you're getting hit for too much, it doesn't help you much. And on the note of defense, your armor is capped at 85% damage reduction, and resistances are next to useless because they are multiplicative, but in a bad way. So don't stress too much about those. Focus on armor, focus on health, focus on damage reduction. For one-handed weapons, you want to try to get critical strike damage as the first perk on it. You could go with damage to close or damage to distant enemies, but in general, I like to stay away from damage bonuses that are based on something else because we don't always know when that uptime is going to be. From there, the affixes we're looking for are crit strike damage, vulnerable damage, core skill damage, possibly ultimate skill damage. Now, you can also go with damage to close or distant enemies, but I would only do that if you have that on the weapon perk as well, so that it doubles up and increases that. That's for math reasons, but basically double up on that. And then on this one hand, you also want to try and fit in the all stat bonus. Now for offhands, now I haven't been running caster, so I'm not too familiar with offhands, but in general, if you're running this, you want cooldown reduction. That's why you're running it. On the affixes side, we're looking at crit strike chance and cooldown reduction for the main 2 affixes. From there, it's kind of based on your build. We have CC duration, barrier generation, mana cost reduction, and very rarely, if you're desperate, damage reduction from burning or damage reduction from other proc things. Again, I don't love those, but if you can fit it into something that is constantly happening, then it's worth it. And let's look at the big boys, two-handed weapons. We really want to go with vulnerability damage. However, damage to CC enemies is also pretty good. For affixes, we're looking at, again, vulnerability damage, crit strike damage, core skill damage, and then we have elemental crit strike damage, which is pretty good. And you can also fit in ultimate skill damage. And just like the one-hand weapon, it's only really used for when you're running ultimates. Now, these affixes are probably your best option, but we also have to consider your Paragon boards. Paragon rare nodes and glyphs have stat requirements to unlock their full potential. So that means that we need to have stats on our gear. But while you're planning your gear, choose 3 armor pieces to have a single non-main stat on. This will give you a decent raw boost overall, but more importantly, it will open up your Paragon nodes. Paragon nodes are a whole thing that I'm not getting into here, but like and subscribe to catch that video later on. And then for weapons, this is where we want to have our all stat affix on. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and run over our jewelry. For amulet, you get resist all. That's it. For the affixes, we want to have ranks to a set of skills. You want to have this to be your beneficial skill, whatever one you're doing the most damage with. From there, we also can have ranks to one passive skill. Now, this is really important because this is where you can get bonus crit strike damage, bonus vulnerability damage, and things you can't normally get on an amulet. From there, we have bonus percent damage, and then damage to elites. After that, it kind of depends on you and your build. I have some listed here. A type of skill damage, which is, a damage increase, but it's required. And then we have main stat increase as well. This is for later in-game builds. When you have a lot of main stat, this percentage increase, you're going to get more bang for your buck. Now, rings on the other hand are pretty standard. These are ones that you really want to have the same affixes on pretty much for everybody. Now, you're going to get 2 resist types, so that means you can get different resistances on each of those items. For the affixes, we're looking for crit chance, crit damage, vulnerability damage. Those are your main top 3. And for the 4th one, you really want to go with like an elemental or whatever the type of skill damage you can get, because that's more of a consistent thing. There's also max life and max mana and some other options that are pretty good. As I go through this gear, you'll notice I focus on offensive affixes, but there's a reason. Armor and resistances are not as impactful when pushing high level content. The Ginger Gamer has a very in-depth video discussing this, but I'll shorten it up for you here. Fighting monsters 17 levels or higher than your current level makes your armor and resistance levels pretty much useless. But that means that damage mitigation from aspect skills, barriers, or fortification are much more important. So make sure to run Aspect of Disobedience on your amulet to get the most out of it and actually have some damage mitigation. If you do focus on damage mitigation in your gear, then focus on one type so that the numbers stack up. Basically, defensive stats are multiplicative, but in a bad way. You don't want to have a balance of mitigation sources. You want one big source of mitigation. So all that being said, if you're running same level content or only 3 levels above, then you'll get more out of your armor and resistances. So they're not that bad to have while leveling and grinding, but once you hit in-game sigils and you start pushing level 95 monsters on a level 60 character, they're pretty much a waste. And talking about damage, if you're here, you've heard about damage buckets. I'm not going to go into detail over it, but we do need to know we want damage buckets that are consistently active, and we want them to all be somewhat equal in level. You don't want to focus on all your crit, all vulnerability. You want a lot of crit and a lot of vulnerability. You get more bang for your buck by having them somewhat equal. And one thing we didn't talk about too much is the aspects. Planning your aspects is also really, really important. So check out some of the builders out there. Lorthic is usually the most up-to-date and data mines all the info. He does great stuff. Now, d4builds.gg is my favorite at the moment because it just has a great UI. d4planner.io is really gorgeous and kind of keeps the same theme as Diablo 4. And now you're ready to organize your gear. Now, if you seem overwhelmed, I will be doing a stash organization video later on, so make sure to like and subscribe to catch that one when it comes out. In general though, if it doesn't match up with your best in slot item plan, sell it. For now, that's it for me. Good luck out there.